What is up, fellas, and welcome to another episode of Rewriting History with me, the Goob. Today, I'm going to be discussing the predynastic vases, and I'm not going to be doing analysis of the data. I'm going to be doing analysis of all of the people involved and some of the drama that's gone down, some of the contradictory claims. Before I get into all of that, I actually need some assistance from you guys in the audience, if you're able to. One of the things that I'm going to be discussing is about a year ago, maybe even like 18 months ago, very roughly about a year ago, Ben Van Kerkwyk from Uncharted X put out a video where he stated that he was going to be traveling to the Boston Museum because that was the location where he had tracked down the Toshka artifacts, these potential ancient stone vases that are 11,000 years old, 8,000 years old, way older than even the pre-dynastic vases we've been discussing. He tracked down the artifacts to the Boston Museum, found that to be the most likely location to find them. And so he planned a visit to the museum to visit their warehouses, their storehouses, to find these things. And then he was going to report back on what he found or didn't find. He recently went to the Boston Museum, and I assume that this trip is the trip that he was discussing. But there appears to be no word from him from this recent trip about those Toshka vessels. So if anyone knows the clip that I'm talking about, his videos are like 3 hours long, and I don't know exactly what video it came from. So I haven't been able to refine that clip, but if anyone knows what I'm talking about and can share that with me, I'd greatly appreciate it, because I would really love to know what he found at the Boston Museum, or if that trip is still upcoming. Maybe there's another trip to the Boston Museum coming, but I would love to get to the bottom of that. So if anyone can help me out, please do. I also have, I think, a good answer to why the private vessels that are held by Matt Bell and others show such extreme precision, and how they might still be legitimate ancient artifacts while showing modern day levels of precision. So I'm going to drop that in this video. But again, this video is not about the analysis of the data. If you want that, I released a video 7 months ago. Link is in the description. And that is still the best analysis of all of the data from the Petrie Museum to date. You're not going to find a better video than that. I absolutely nailed it. You will eventually see the consensus come into line with what I shared in that video. It might take several months or even a few years, but you're going to see that I was absolutely 100% spot on with that analysis. And to summarize it in a single sentence, none of the vessels from the Petrie Museum show any indication of machinery or lathing. They are handmade. So with that out of the way, and you can skip to like 1650 in that video, because the starts talking about the SAR scan data in Egypt. The Vase discussion starts around the 16, 17-minute mark. With that all said, let's go ahead and address some of the drama, some of the contradictory claims. Let me lay out a timeline for what's been going on with these vases. So this all kind of started with Ben Van Kerkwyk several years ago. And the OG spinner vase was scanned, and it had remarkable precision. I mean, well beyond anything that would be capable of being produced with hand tools. This was obviously machined, obviously lathed. And that's what sparked this whole journey, if you will. And this project was started by true believers, right? Ben Van Kerkwyk truly believes that these are evidence of lost high technology from pre-dynastic Egypt. Now, right off the bat, that kind of is a bit of a recipe for disaster, because even if your ultimate goal is to get to the truth, you obviously have bias there, right? This project was started by biased people who truly believe in what they think happened, which is lost high technology in Egypt. And then you also have the mainstream just relentlessly attacking these people, and completely unfairly attacking these people. That I've done multiple videos fact checking the Vase debunkers. These people are just throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. They're relentless, they're aggressive, they're angry. So you combine that with biased people, and you're really creating a recipe for disaster, a recipe for these people, even if their intentions overall are good, to be human and to make mistakes and maybe be less than forthcoming. So has that happened? Well, we end up getting scans from Matt Bell, who owns these vases privately, done by Max Amachev, and they release their analysis, which link down in the description to Max's website if you want to go check that out. And I've discussed this analysis before. I've said it's good analysis, but it also is very incomplete analysis. They give you the conclusion. They don't really, it's like turning in a math test that has all the answers and the answers are correct, but none of the steps are shown, right? So there were a lot of people who questioned this data, who questioned this analysis, and we really weren't given the tools to analyze it ourselves. We just kind of had to trust Max and to trust Matt that they were telling the truth. A little while later, Karoli Poka gets involved, and he ends up scanning 19 vessels from the Petrie Museum. So these are no longer privately held vessels. These are actual ancient artifacts from ancient Egypt. And after a few months, Stein Gerdes, who had been working behind the scenes for this entire time, analyzing data for them, but not interacting with the public directly, she drops a massive data drop where she gives all of the scans for these 19 vessels. She gives a complete analysis of them. And unlike Max's analysis, it shows all of the steps along the way. You start with the raw data, and she takes you through every step of the process, showing her work. It's absolutely fantastic. Link down in the description to her website, the ArcSci website, which if you have the patience and you have the time, I strongly encourage you to go check that out. You're not going to find better analysis on the vases than hers. But if you want the video format, my link in the description, it's breaking down that analysis just in a video. And after she released this, Karoli Poka responded by threatening to sue her. So they had been sitting on these scans for months. They did the scans and they didn't release any information. Then Stein releases all of the information, and Karoli goes, "You didn't have permission to release that. We're going to sue you." Stein claps back and goes, "Hey, I've been working with you guys for years. The messaging, both internally and externally, has consistently been that all of this is meant to be open sourced, that, you know, the entire purpose of the project is to release all of the data freely to the public. And so that's what I did. I completed my data and I released it to the public." There was a little bit of back and forth between these two. And ultimately, it seemed that Karoli realized, one, he couldn't actually sue her. Two, the data was already out there. And three, he was just drawing more attention to this than if he had just let it lie. I think when I followed Stein Gerdes, I think she had 49 followers on X. It was an extremely small account. Very, very few people even realized that this data had been released publicly. And so anyways, I don't think any lawsuits are coming, but it was a very negative, very aggressive response from Karoli initially. And then when all of this happened, Matt Bell, because all of these people are working on these things together, but they're also all working individually. So like Karoli's actions don't reflect on Matt and vice versa and all of this. So there was some pressure by myself and some other individuals on Matt Bell to go, "Hey, you have been saying this is all meant to be open sourced. You've had these STL files for all of these vases, the private collection vases, the modern vases that have now been scanned, and now the Petrie vessels that had been scanned." And it's like, you've only released like 2 or 3 of these STL files at this point in time. When are we going to get the rest? When are you going to open source this information? And so Matt goes, "Yeah, you're right. We're gonna do that." A few months later, which is the link down in the description to Max's website, you have the full release of all of the STL files. So these are the raw scans of these vessels. This is as transparent as it gets, right? But it did take a little bit of pressure from people. It did take a little bit of time. Similarly, with Matt Bell, I think it's important to remember that Matt Bell is not an expert on these things. He does not understand structured light scans. He does not understand metrology. He's an intelligent guy. He's a CEO. He's a podcaster. But his role is an in-between person. He is helping the experts communicate with the public. He himself is not an expert. So I've seen Matt Bell make some statements. People have called him out on it. They go, hey, this isn't really adding up. This isn't making sense. And Matt goes, you know what? Let me consult with the experts. Let me go bring your questions to them. And he comes back and he corrects himself. And he goes, yeah, you were absolutely right. I misspoke here. So, while there's a little bit of hesitancy maybe from Matt Bell to be forthcoming with the information, like ultimately, I've seen him consistently do the correct thing, consistently come out with true and honest information and be transparent, even if it does take a little bit of time. But Caroli, like I said, he aggressively attacked Stein for releasing this information. And then a few months later, he comes out with a podcast where he's finally discussing the Petri results now several months after I had put out my analysis, after Stein released her analysis. And it's entirely contradictory to the conclusions that I drew in my video and that Stein-Gerdes drew in her analysis. And he's making the statements that these Petri vessels are highly precise, that they're directly comparable to the private scans, and that they are clear evidence of lost high technology and lathing in Egypt. And when this video first came out, I was genuinely confused. I thought that maybe these were new scans that I hadn't seen, or at the very least, like there was some new analysis that was done that I wasn't privy to. Because again, my conclusion is very definitively that while some of these vessels are incredibly impressive from the Petri Museum, they are also very clearly handmade. And I realized eventually that these aren't new vessels being discussed, and there is no new analysis being discussed. And on top of that, unlike Matt Bell, I do believe that Caroli Poca is a metrologist. Like, I believe that's his profession, is metrology. So he should understand these things. He should. There's no excuse for him coming out and making these statements. And then shortly after that, Matt Bell released a podcast with Max Amachev. Max, along with Stein-Gerdes, were the people who were actually analyzing this data. They are the metrologists. They are the experts. And Max makes the same statements that Caroli Poca makes. He says that these are high precision. They're directly comparable to the vases held privately by Matt Bell, and that they're obvious, undeniable evidence of machining and lathing. Again, I was confused by this and eventually realized that, yes, it's still the same data. It's still the same scans. And I don't understand how they're coming to this conclusion. Keep in mind, Matt Bell is not an expert. He's going along with what the expert, Max, is saying. Very recently, Matt Bell released a tweet where he said he had a very long conversation with Max, and Max has retracted all of the statements that he made on his show. He no longer believes that these are directly comparable to the private vases. They're no longer evidence of machining and lathing, and that these do seem to be the product of handmade processes, despite being very impressive. Okay, so we've got, like I said, people who are true believers, people who very clearly do have a bias, who want to prove themselves correct. But also you have Matt Bell, who consistently, while he is human, he makes missteps. He has corrected those. He's been very open about the mistakes he's made. And he did eventually release all of the data. So I would say, while I maybe no longer praise him to the same extent where I was saying that this is the most transparent, most honest discussion to have ever taken place, he's still doing an excellent job. And for someone who does have a bias and who is so relentlessly attacked, not only by the mainstream, but even by alternate people. Down in the description, I linked my video where I'm fact checking debunking Dan's video, where he openly, deliberately lies in order to slander these people and accuse them of fudging their data and lying to the public, right? Like, the attacks really have been relentless, and they've been from all over. So that makes it really difficult to maintain that honesty and that transparency when you know that every little thing you release is going to get attacked. And God forbid you release something that doesn't actually support your claims, like the Petri scan data. That it's going to be used in very dirty ways against you. So considering all of that, I think that Matt Bell has actually done a fantastic job of maintaining transparency and honesty. Karoli Poka, on the other hand, I'm not going to sit here and call him a fraud or anything like that, but his actions are a lot less defensible. I don't know how trustworthy he actually is. Again, he is a metrologist, so it's kind of hard to give him the same grace that I'm extending to Matt Bell. Why did Max make these statements on Matt Bell? Again, you're dealing with true believers. You're dealing with a project that's been going on for years now. A lot of time, a lot of money has been invested into this, and a lot of attacks have been made on these people. I honestly don't believe that Matt ever sat down and put any pressure on Max to skew things towards his perspective. However, it's like, he's a human being. Of course, there is pressure on him to present things in a way that's going to benefit their cause, right? Even without anyone putting pressure on him, that pressure just exists. It's present, right? And so I think that's what you're seeing. I think you're seeing someone who was trying to find a way to present this data as favorably as they could. It wasn't entirely honest, but there weren't lies, right? There's a difference between presenting something as objectively as possible and outright lying about something, right? They didn't lie about the data. They didn't change the numbers or anything like that. But they were being misleading in their presentation. The Petri vessels are clearly handmade. And there's a lot more data that's been dropped from Stein-Gerdes recently that I haven't analyzed yet. So in an upcoming video, I'll be doing that. There'll be more analysis to be had. But this is just discussing the players involved, right? And we've seen the mainstream. They're obviously not trustworthy. They have you can go watch Night Scare, one of the biggest detractors on these vases, and you can watch my responses to him. It's like, even within the same video, he'll attack from one side, and then he'll attack from a completely opposite polar end of the spectrum, where both attacks are mutually exclusive and contradict each other, but they're just throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. So you can't trust the mainstream. You can't trust the debunkers. You certainly can't trust the dedunkers. And I'm not sure if you can trust Karoli, but you absolutely can trust Stein-Gerdes. Stein-Gerdes not only has been unbelievably transparent and thorough with her analysis, but she even did so at the risk of alienating the people that she's working with, right? Her and Karoli, I'm pretty sure, do not get along anymore. It seems that she's still working with Matt, and she's still working with Max. Maybe not as directly with Matt anymore, but the overall project, again, individuals are working on this, and they're working in collaboration with each other, but it is all individual efforts. I don't think that Karoli's actions reflect on Matt at all. I think that Matt is still a trustworthy guy, if not human, and not an expert. I think that Max Amachev, right, his analysis does correlate and line up with Stein-Gerdes. And they did ultimately release the STL files. They did ultimately give all of the raw data for you to do your own analysis if you want. And now that I've kind of summed up that a little bit, let me get into how we explain this extremely anomalous precision from these privately held artifacts, which also extends to the privately held artifacts that are on display in museums. There are a lot of artifacts on display in museums that are not directly from dig sites, but come from private collections. And they also happen to show this remarkable precision and this remarkable finishing, right? One of the things that was noted by the Vase scan project that seemed to surprise the Vase scan project is when they inspected the Petri vessels, they noticed how worn they were. They looked like they were 6,500 years old. They had weather and wear and damage on them. And some of them were still remarkably precise, but you could tell that they were old. Compare this to the OG spinner vase, which has like a mirror polish on it. You can almost see your reflection in it. You can shine a light through it. It's so thin. These privately held vessels they look brand new. They look brand new. And they're way more precise. So obviously, these are products of modern machinery, right? Well, I believe they are, and I believe they're also legitimate ancient artifacts. I watched Night Scarab's most recent video on the vases. Again, pure propaganda, entirely bullshit. It's not worth a watch. It's garbage. But like all of his videos, he does manage to make a good point or two. And I think he maybe made his best point yet in this video, which is that if you are someone who is trying to sell artifacts, ancient artifacts on the black market, how would you go about maximizing your profit? So you find this ancient vase and it looks like it's 6,500 years old. It's worn, it's beat up, it's rough. Well, what could you do to that ancient vase? You could pop it on a lathe and you could polish up that exterior and make it look nice and shiny again, and probably double or triple or quadruple the value of that vase on the black market, right? And so I think that's actually exactly what we're seeing with a lot of these precision vases, is they have tool marks that look identical to the other vases, like the ones in the Petri Museum on the interior, right? And they have similar precision levels on the interior as the vases in the Petri Museum, and yet the exterior shows this remarkable, well beyond. In fact, let me pull up real quick if I can. Let's see if I have it accessible here. Yeah, so let me share my screen. Give me a moment. Give me a moment as I try to find. Here we go. Hold up. Here we go. Sorry, I have too many tabs open right now. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. Sorry for my slowness, but I'm getting there. Give me a second. Okay. Nope. Here we go. Okay, so here we have all of these vases and their precision plotted out on a graph here. And the private collection vessels are in yellow, and those are the most precise out of any of the vessels scanned, which is what I've been saying consistently the whole time, that those vessels, they're even better than our modern day machining standards, which you can see very clearly right here. Here's the industrial vases, which are made on industrial modern lathes today in green, and you can see those are less precise than these yellow vessels. Okay, and some of these yellow vessels are at least a few hundred years old. They date back at least to the 1800s. So even if these were modern forgeries, these are very impressive modern forgeries considering they were made 200 years ago. But I don't think that's what you're looking at. What I think you're looking at is the Petri Museum vessels in blue here, right? You can see some of these have remarkable precision on the interior and the exterior. The JV019 is almost comparable to these privately held vessels and is even more impressive than a lot of these industrial lathe-made vases. And remember, my conclusion for all of the Petri vessels is that they were clearly handmade. That's really, really good. So imagine you take a vessel like that and then you pop it on a lathe and you polish up the outside a little bit. I think exactly this is what you would expect to find as the result, are what we see in these private vessels. So, how do we have, how do we make sense of this extreme precision existing on the exterior of these vessels, while they are still 200 years old, and the vase believers believe them to be many thousands of years old? I think that's what we're looking at, is we're looking at legitimate ancient artifacts that someone put on a lathe, polished the outside of the vessel, made it real nice and shiny and precise, and then sold it on the black market. That's far less effort than creating one of these from scratch, right? But it also allows you to achieve that significantly higher price point on the black market by doing something that's rather accessible and rather easy and rather common sense. You got a vase, it's an impressive vase, but it's 6,500 years old. It looks shitty because it's 6,500 years old. Polish it up, pop it on a lathe. You get extreme precision on the outside, you get it nice and shiny, you sell it for 10 times as much. Bada bing, bada boom. So please feel free to call in if you guys have any comments on this. I'm going to read through the chat a little bit, give you a moment to call in if you want to discuss this. What do you think about that idea? What do you think about that idea of these legitimate ancient artifacts that are a combination of 6,500 years old and modern machinery? Because there is a very clear discrepancy between the privately held artifacts being well polished. And it makes sense that if you're trying to sell things on the black market, you're going to look for the best stuff. You want to get the most money you can. So you're going to try and sell the best objects you can sell. So they're already going to be starting with the best looking vases, but then why not make them look even better? That doesn't require a master craftsman. That doesn't require you to be able to make one of these masterpieces from scratch. It only requires putting it on a lathe and polishing it. That's very accessible to someone. And if you're, hung up on between the handles, well, for one thing, on these scans, we've seen that the least accurate area of these vases is the area between the handles. It's still remarkably precise. But then going back to Night Scare, like I said, he does make a few good points in each video, even though overall the videos are absolutely garbage propaganda. And he did highlight, he asked a Chinese manufacturer how they would go about making that area between the handles. And he proposed a very reasonable solution, which is you make a firm guide with abrasives, and then you just have to rub that guide back and forth between those handles. And that's entirely in line with the level of precision that we see on these vases. I think that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at legitimate ancient artifacts that have been turned on modern machinery. And of course, I'm sure there's modern fakes, entire modern fakes that are mixed in there. And I'm sure there's entirely legitimate ancient artifacts that are mixed in there. But some of these anomalous things, and we're going to have to inspect the interiors of these vases. We need a lot more scans of vases to be done to actually determine what we're looking at. I think, despite my conclusion that the Petri vessels were handmade, I think there is still a mystery here. I think there's still a lot of answers that we need. I think, as much as I've spoken against Ben's ideas of inheritance, I think that he could still be onto something with these vases. You do still have civilization following the production of these vases. You do still have the anomalous nature of these vases in comparison to other artifacts from that time. Even with these being handmade, these are still way more impressive than the other artifacts we're finding from predynastic Egypt. Why is so much, and actually with these being handmade and not lathe made, it speaks to an even higher degree of effort being put into these vases than if they were lathe made. right? Because these are rivaling. We saw some of those handmade vessels being even more precise than some of the modern lathe-made vessels of today. So to do that by hand requires an extraordinary amount of effort. So why, before we even have dynastic Egypt, and when everything else from that time period is in line with a Stone Age civilization, do we have these very anomalous faces? Why do we have Petrie for doing his initial analysis saying there's obvious evidence of lathing happening in pre-dynastic Egypt, right? I think there's still a great mystery to be solved here. I think far more scanning needs to be done. And we don't have the answers. We can't draw conclusions yet. But I do think that adding that little piece of the puzzle of ancient vessels that have been turned on modern lathes, I think could be very useful in trying to make sense of all of this data that is currently quite messy. So let me read through chat, and when I'm done with that, if no one wants to call in, Leeside, what video is that? Can you share what video that's from? Because you can't post links. In fact, here, I will make you a moderator after this video so that you can post links. But 1603 in video, the tiny ancient artifacts changing history. I will check that out. I'll absolutely check that out, Leeside. Thank you for that. Stein-Gerdes does have her own bias. My understanding is that she was asked to leave the project after she released the data. And she's also still working with these people, right? She's still working with Max. I didn't even go into all of that, right? Stein made some accusations against Matt and Max and others about actually corrupting the data, about actually altering the scans and such. And she wasn't necessarily wrong, but from what I could tell, I don't think there was this intentional manipulation of data. I think that humans are human, and I think a couple of scans got mislabeled. And even from Stein's accusations, it wouldn't really make sense for them to be obscuring the data in the way that she was suggesting, because it was just a few of these scans. It was a few out of many scans that she's going, hey, these have been altered. And maybe they did actually alter a couple scans, but I think what's more likely is they messed up with some labeling. They mislabeled a couple scans. And even according to her accusations, this wasn't like a widespread fraud. It wasn't like all of the data was corrupted. It was like, here's some examples of things not matching up. And you could go through Stein's website and find tons of typos. I mean, she's typed thousands and thousands of words on this subject, and it's in English, her second or third language. So it's like, she's human. She makes mistakes. There's typos on her website. That doesn't mean she's lying or misrepresenting the data. And I don't think it's true for Matt either. Although with Caroli, seems like there is some truth to it. And I think that's the main beef, is between Caroli and Stein. I don't believe they're working together anymore, but I know she's still working with Max, and I believe she's still at least tangentially working with Matt. So yes, there's biases all over. I think overall these people are trustworthy, with the exception of maybe Caroli. And I'm not even saying he's not trustworthy. I'm just saying I'm not really making a stance either way. He's in a gray area right now. The rest of these people involved, I have pretty high thoughts of them. I think they're doing a good job, and they are biased. They are human, but they're doing a good job. Okay. Yes. So I actually disagree with you, Lee Side. Not about their capability of shaping hard stones for other purposes. I don't believe that's what the mace heads were used for. I do not believe the mace heads are grinding discs. I can go more in depth into that if you would like, but I've got pretty solid reasoning for believing they're not. grinding discs, which I think is what you're suggesting here. I actually really like Matt Bell's video about the mace heads, which was a very recent video from like a month or two ago, where he makes the claim that they start with a blank, right? They tube drill it. Maybe it's a square and they tube drill it out, right? Or whatever. But the mace heads are actually a byproduct of the vases. So you start with this blank and you start to shape the vase. And then at the bottom of this blank, you're left with a shape like the mace heads. And then when you separate the vase from that base, which some of these vases still have the base attached, they still have a foot on them. Some of them have the cone base, some of them have a flat base, right? But so for the ones that have that foot removed, well, what do you do with that foot now? You now have still a nicely shaped piece of stone that you could just discard, or you could turn into a mace head or have it serve some other purpose. And I think that's a pretty likely scenario. So I really don't believe the mace heads are for shaping the vases. I have solid reasoning to believe that. And that's the best explanation I've seen, is that they're actually a byproduct of the vases themselves. And I do believe that they were probably used as maces. And I've discussed this a bit previously. I've done a pretty decent amount of research into that subject. And yeah, I like the idea of them being a byproduct. Okay, yeah. Well, if these were a byproduct of the vases, I don't know how much that impacts your argument, right? Because they're shaping the stone vase and this is being a byproduct. That's kind of, it's a byproduct. So that's from the vases. And yes, I'm not suggesting that they didn't have the ability to work hard stone. You look at the Petri vessels, I think those are legitimately a product of predynastic Egypt. And I think those are a product of the tools that they had available in predynastic Egypt. But I would still classify them as anomalous within predynastic Egypt. They were made in large quantities, and they were made, some of them, extremely well. And we don't see the same volume or the same quality in other artifacts from predynastic Egypt. Even comparing like the Nakeda mace head, it's very nice. It's limestone. It's very impressive. I don't know if it's been scanned. I don't know the level of circular precision on it, but it looks good despite its damage. But like that's a very ceremonial, very symbolic object for a king. And it's maybe comparable to the vases, right? It might be comparable. It might not be. I'd have to see a scan of it. But again, like that is an outlier object itself. That is a ceremonial, symbolic object for a king, a very important object for a king. And we don't see this type of production, broadly speaking, in predynastic Egypt outside of these vases. Right. I think I just addressed that, Lisa. I feel like I just addressed that. So I understand what you're saying. I still think the vases are anomalous. They're in higher volume and higher precision than what we see of other comparable artifacts. They're not alone. Yes, they were shaping hard stone. They were shaping soft stone. You look at the Narmer palettes, they were doing some really beautiful things. I'm not trying to discredit the predynastic Egyptians and their abilities whatsoever. I still think there is an abnormal degree of effort put towards these vases that we don't see put towards the rest of their society. And you combine that with things like the vases somewhat, or rather civilization and the consolidation of power and kingship in this actual unification and power consolidation trailing the production of the vases. And you see this anomalous degree of effort put into these vases. The idea that predynastic Egyptians found a stash of vases very similarly to the way that we found a stash of vases under the Djoser pyramid 4,500 years later, I think that's a viable idea. I used to speak out against that idea a lot and say that it's very unlikely. And I'm not saying that it's a certainty by any stretch of the means, but I think it's something that should be considered when we're analyzing all of this. I think there's enough evidence to make a reasonable argument for that case. In comparison to the other arguments being made, I think it stands up decently well. And we need a lot more information, like I said, before we can actually narrow down these conclusions and figure out what was truly going on. And I hope that that combination idea of pre-dynastic and modern will help in that. But yeah, man, of course I'm biased. I don't say that I'm not, dude. Before the Petri data dropped by Stein, I was telling you with 99% certainty that these are legitimate ancient artifacts. I've now reduced that to 60-40, right? And taken to play that combo idea of pre-dynastic and modern. I don't know how that really affects my views in percentage wise, but yeah, after that Petri data, I had to adjust my analysis, and I go, I think it's 60-40 that like these are still ancient. There's still a mystery here. There's still anomalous artifacts in pre-dynastic Egypt, but these are handmade. So the idea that those privately held vessels are modern forgeries is a hell of a lot more likely now than what I used to think. I'm absolutely biased. I absolutely want this to rewrite history. I want this to be the thing that changes everything. But I'm going to follow the data. I'm going to speak what I believe to be true, regardless of what I want to be true. And I think that can be said for Matt Bell. I think that can be said for Max Amachev. I think that can be said for Stein Gerdes. And I think that can probably be said for Ben from Uncharted X, although that question I proposed at the very beginning of this video, what actually happened with that Boston Museum visit is going to impact my view of Ben. If he did go and he found these vessels and they were clay and they weren't stone, and then he just chose not to release that information to the public, that obviously is going to impact my opinions of Ben. But Ben has been around for a very long time. I have had very high opinions of Ben for a very long time. I think that Ben has conducted himself very well over the years. So I'd be a bit surprised if that ended up being the case, but I could also see it happening. So anyways, doesn't look like anyone wants to call in. I don't know if it'll be next week, but sometime soon I am going to be looking at all of the new data that Stein dropped because I haven't analyzed it yet. And hey, maybe I'll be singing an entirely different tune next week, because that's what happened 7 months ago. I released a video where I was saying these are, 99% certainty ancient artifacts. And then literally the very next week, I go 60-40. I go, this changes everything, right? So maybe I'll change everything again. But I'm going to take a look at that data, and I'll if it's interesting, I'll put a video out on it. Do check out my video from 7 months ago. I was right. I was 100% right. Caroli contradicted it. He was wrong. He's being misleading. Matt contradicted it with Max. Max has retracted that to align with me. That is going to become the consensus, is that those vessels are clearly handmade. And it's rather interesting. I mean, I have put dozens and dozens of hours into understanding the capabilities of various applications of hand tools, of various applications of, power tools in modern machinery. And it's difficult to translate that understanding to you guys with like visuals and stuff like this, because a lot of it's tangential information. But I'm very confident in my analysis from 7 months ago. I'm very confident in it, and I believe that will become the consensus. Thank you for tuning in, Leeside. It's good to see you. It's always a pleasure. I'll check out that video that you linked. And until next time, peace out, fellas. Thank you for tuning in. Give it a like. Give it a comment down below. Help me out in the algorithm, fellas. You're getting the best analysis on the entire internet on these vases, and it's got I think less than 100 views. So give me a little love, and I'll catch you guys next week. Peace out.